What are we going to do here? We'll change this up a little bit because we're a smaller group. So first off, let me introduce myself. My name is Robin Mickelson. I'm the president of AWP University. We are an organization specifically tuned towards training in AWP. We offer services in both in-person training as well as mock project exercises within corporate organizations. We also have a full forward-facing corporate LMS system and an LMS system that's full retail. And what do I mean by full retail? Look us up, awpu.com. You can go throw out a credit card and take a course at any particular time, anytime you want, and it's fully self-directed online. They are certificate-based courses, and they are fully endorsed by CII, which means they are PDU carrying. So if you're an engineer, you can take our courses and maintain your PDUs. I hope that transfers to Europe. Do they call them PDUs here? There you go. Okay, thank you for the translation. All right, so we were going to do things with bringing up a little slide-out just to identify who all is in the room, but I'm not going to do that. Let's have a smaller conversation. Being that we are a little bit smaller group, why don't we start at this table? Nigel, why don't you introduce yourself, and let's start a bit of a conversation here today rather than just me trying to ram information at you.
So Nigel Harper, company's IPD, we're more lean implementation of partnering than others.
Excellent, welcome.
Dave Murphy, I work for Mercury Engineering, a senior business specialist for Mercury.
Okay.
Ashley Flanagan, test manager for Mercury Engineering as well, and we've been using TestMax since 2019. Test actually, I say WorkPax.
There you go.
Test manager head on me there. WorkPax since 2019.
Excellent. You guys are building full test box integrated into AWP?
We're getting
Working. Okay, excellent. In the back.
Jeff Ryan, previous presenter, AWP guy.
Colleague next to you.
Steve Lord, I work for Jeff, I do all the time and service leads.
Excellent.
Graham Hutchison, construction manager with Morgan. Front end, trying to get WorkPax set up and design driven by construction commission.
Excellent.
I'm Lisa Jones, I'm with Group ASI.
Excellent.
I'm Krista Lowen and I work with AWP University.
Thank you. My right hand girl.
Marshall Wheeler, I work with Eastman Chemical.
And my fellow colleague in the back.
Hi, in the back, Andrew Troy with O3 on the VP of AWP Construction.
All right, the man who needs no introduction. So we got a lot of AWP knowledge in the room here. We've got several people that have been at this since the beginning. A little bit of history about myself. Now we've heard a little bit about you. I've been in construction about 25 years now. Started in the trades. I worked in industrial manufacturing as a pneumatic fitter and structural welder. I was injured, went back to school, trained as an engineer, went back out to the field. Guess who I met there? This gentleman, Mr. Jeff Ryan. We worked together on creating, in essence, what was the work-phase planning model some 15 plus years ago. That work-phase planning model with COA has grown over the years. It's been adopted by multiple other research groups such as CII. You've heard the term CII thrown around a lot. I am a CII registered educational provider. It's been a home to me for 15, 20 years since we developed some of these methodologies or helped develop them. And CII is now a best practice within, of course, CII, and they are kind of the governing body of all the research for AWP. However, of course, the industry globally has endorsed and grabbed AWP as their own. So it's taking on a lot of different views and a lot of different movement over the last decade, and we're very proud of that fact. So, what are we here for? We're going to look at a little bit of, a quick presentation
So
on.
just to add to
Go
your
ahead.
resume before you go on there. So Robin was also the bridge between COA and CII. So when CII first came looking at work-phase planning, they were like, that looks okay. And Robin was making trips down there to educate them on what work-phase planning was, and of course what we had already recognised was the gaps.
Yes.
Such as engineering and procurement. So don't sell yourself short on that. You're a facilitator.
All right, thank you very much, Jeff. Yeah, I like the way you put that. Myself, I look at it as I was working with CII and CO at the same time, and I got too lazy to work with both groups, so I amalgamated them. So it's easier to work with one group and bring us all together into one place. So thank you for that, Jeff. So I was going to ask your levels of experience. We've kind of done that. I was going to go through what you guys think the major implementation aspects are to AWP, and what do I mean by that? What do you really have to get right? And let's look at it from an early project point of view, because when we say we need to get it right, we often think about early project for our implementation, because if you miss the ball on some things, your entire thing will go sideways. Jeff, what do you think is one of the top items for implementation of AWP? If you don't get this right,
So we actually boiled it down into closing packages.
okay? Excellent.
You have to close, the focus has to be to close packages. And we boiled that down a little bit further into a little saying that is stop starting, start finishing.
I like that a lot. I think that's a very good example. I've visited a lot of sites, and I've been hired to do a lot of audits of different implementations of AWP. There are two things that I look at when I get to site immediately that sets the stage for, is it a positive implementation or is it off the rails? One of them is RFIs. And what do I mean by RFIs? Where do they come from? If they are launched by the planning department, hell, that planning department's having a good look at what's happening, and they know if they've got a lot of RFIs that came from planning, very good. If they've got a lot of RFIs that came from the field, that means, and RFIs, requests for information, meaning we got some kind of problem here, I don't understand what's going on. If they're coming from the field, we've missed the boat. That is the second thing that I look at, or nearly right aligned with it. If they're not closing their IWPs, they've lost control from the field. Very plain and simple. It's definitely one of the top things. We're going to look at some of the earlier things, but thank you, Jeff, because that's a big one. Somebody else want to volunteer another one? Andrew, I know you got lots.
Especially if you're talking about the early ones, path of construction is huge. If you can't agree on the sequence in the beginning, and if you don't have the right people in the room to discuss it,
Right.
I mean, I've worked on projects where I asked the construction manager what the path of construction was, and he phoned the engineering manager, which didn't go down very well.
Right.
So it's making sure it is, we talk about being a construction-driven process, so it's making sure it's being pushed forward from the right position and getting the right people in the room.
Excellent, excellent. And you're leading into some of the stuff we will cover today. So you hit it. I think if it was The Price is Right, we'd hear it ding and something would twist. But let's move forward. Anybody else got something they wanna add? What would be a hot topic in early setup of a AWP program? Nigel, let's put Lean on the spot.
So I suppose, from my perspective, being really clear what the outcomes are, what we're trying to get out of this thing, and be really clear going in, what we're trying to get coming out.
Excellent, excellent. I think that's a very good segue into our next one. Let's talk about Swimlanes. One of the very first things, in my opinion, when we're setting up a program that will identify whether you're going to be successful or not, is identifying our swim lanes. What do we mean by swim lanes? We're talking about our process implementation documentation, our procedural documentation, those rights of who does what, when, where, and how it interacts with each other. Lots of people build a lot of different process diagrams as far as how these things happen together, how they work together. This is a great starting point. This is often where we will start into identifying those process overlays, identifying those swim lanes. Now, what do we mean by the swim lanes? They're a type of diagram, fair enough. If you've ever worked in Visio or anything else, they're a type of diagram. But what do we typically do with those swim lanes? One of the very first things that we have to do, and it's an important concept to grasp in AWP, and I've worked with a lot of clients that it's like, I get off the plane, walk up to a site, and they go, okay, we have thrown away our procedural documents, we have blank slated this whole thing for you, come in and lay it down for us as to how AWP is supposed to work. We're gonna implement this and we're gonna drive this, we are here for you, we are your team. And then the first thing you say is, whoa, I hope the garbage man hasn't been here, let's pull this out. The idea of what we need to do with AWP is we need to integrate that across our existing procedures. So often the first thing we do is we sit down and we have a lot of conversation. How are you doing things today? What's working, what's not? What are your internal procedures? Every company has some type of internal procedures. If they don't, we got a problem. And maybe we gotta start a little bit earlier in their basis, but those internal procedures, somebody's put a lot of heart into them, somebody has, and usually by committee, spent a lot of time with them. We don't, in the AWP community, believe in the fact that AWP is an OS removal of everything that you're doing and you have to implement this and that's all it is. It's an overlay for how we do work today in the fields. So, how do we build those overlays? We gotta look at what our existing workflows look like. Maybe they look like this, they're a little different. This is a more AWP-centric workflow. Or maybe they're in that orientation of the swim lanes to start with. This is an example of a swim lane. This is public documentation. You can take pictures of it if you wish. Available on the COA website. I suggest you go download it there. There is both native files for it. All this is an overview for the basis of the CII and COA process integration flowcharts. What do we mean by process integration flowcharts? They are an AWP overlay. So, what do we do with them and how do we make them work? Through multiple different meetings and sessions to start with, before we get into true implementation, we're not smoke jumping into the field to do work-phase planning immediately. Here we're setting up an AWP program. We need to identify what our workflows are going to be, who does what when, and the company ones start looking like this, very similar. Then they start to evolve. When we start to evolve into these things, they can seem daunting, quite daunting. But when we look at it, we build them through touch points and identification. This is an existing 2 clients that I have, and it's okay, they've been intentionally de-res to the point where there's nothing identifiable with them other than boxes on the page. But what we're looking at here is an internal development of a work process of how a company executes a project. Then what we do is we map into it certain basic things, the touch points. Where do we need to consider AWP in the present of the existing procedures? We map these touch points in. Next thing we start doing is talking about path of construction. Colleague Andrew here mentioned path of construction is a very important thing that we need to do. It is, and it needs to be mapped into our early identification. So when you look at it, these big blue bars, those are key milestone gates of the path of construction identification. We'll get into that a little bit more because we are going to talk about path of construction. And you can see in this particular instance, down here, these are process flow diagrams that were developed for an organization that is heavy front-loaded centric in bid development. They actually go to full level to POC development before bid process. That's why there's a separation here, because at bid, this is what they do to implement full AWP ahead of time so that they understand what the execution of the project is going to look like to have a more realistic bid package. That's a complicated philosophy, but we will get into that in some of our university documentation. And then you can see further path of construction development. The point here is we're not going to discuss the process, but what we're going to discuss or talk about is how it is that we need to implement AWP in an organization. So who wants to volunteer something? When you start with a new philosophy or a new process, and I'm going to look to you because I know you're in the process of trying to implement AWP right now, as you mentioned. What would be one of the first things that you would do with your process flows within your organization?
One of the first things, well, once we have them in place, it would be to make sure we share them with all the stakeholders and our own internal.
You need to socialize them,
Yeah.
right? And that is one of the main reasons why it's my top answer is you'll get a lot of project participants that'll say, okay, what's this AWP thing? How's it affect me? Does it affect me? Does this mean that I don't have a job or I've got 10 times the job that I once did? These bring everybody together in a team. Identifying a roadmap. If you're like me, I need to know where I'm going and how I'm getting there. I can't just set out without having a clear plan ahead of time. That's what this does. It gives you a clear plan. You are here. This is what you need to do next. When you are implementing a program, just as you mentioned, you need to bring it forward, you need to socialize it. People need to know what the intent is. This demystifies it. I bring these up here because they are daunting. They seem large, but when you start and you just start working it through, it's finally a roadmap of what it is you're supposed to do on the execution of that project, including AWP. It makes life much, much easier. number 2, what will be another aspect? Well, that kind of gives you an idea. We talk about the numbers. You hear a lot about data integration. You hear a lot about, it's all about the data. Well, data doesn't work unless we start talking about coding structures. Very simple when we start talking about coding structures, but it's amazing how many organizations stumble on this topic. AWP is a very data-centric work process that if you don't have your ducks in a row when it comes to the manipulation, the feeding, the use of your data structures, it's going to be very, very difficult. I mean, God love you, you can do AWP with a pen and pencil, and you can do it manually with spreadsheets. I mean, Jeff and I have both been there. We've worked together with pens and paper and, you know, Baylor Twine holding programs together that didn't have much for software in the early days. But today, it is a very data-centric environment. Systems need to talk to each other. What is the main language that they talk to each other from? Our coding structure. If we don't put coding structures in place to begin with, then we end up with requiring heavy-duty systems that can do a lot of lookup, do a lot of convergence of data systems. There are a lot of good data manipulation companies out there, and I call them data manipulation companies, if you will, because they do a great job on prepping and maneuvering the data from one location to the other. A lot of people in the industry, we call those digital threads, meaning what does one system need to do to talk to the other? If we maintain a regular data structure of coding structure, it sounds remedial to say it, but I don't know how many projects I've been to. And Jeff, you tell me, how many projects have you been to that they fight over dashes, dots, underscores? Right, right. It's a systematic issue, it really is. It seems like, well, what are we gonna call something? Let's deal with that later. Let's work on what we're gonna do now. No, this is something that we need to do. I'm a strong proponent of what I call smart nomenclature. What is smart nomenclature? Maybe it's not that common a term. Really all it is I don't like sequential nomenclatures because they are hard to understand. You can't read them, you don't get anything from it. When you look at these, smart nomenclature just basically identifies the project, and without getting too far down into AWP true methodologies. AWP is basically the relationship of work packages, right? From CWA to CWP through to IWP, and then all what I call the support packages around that. Your test packages, those types of things are support packages that would be assigned to those. But there's the 4 main that you follow through. So when we look at it, starting with your CWA, it's the first thing you do when you're breaking down a model or breaking down a data set. So project ID, CWA, there's our nomenclature for our CWAs. Then we keep moving forward and we start to break it down, and as we get more information, we're moving forward. Who's responsible for it? And what I mean by who's responsible is where's it coming? Is it a module? Is it direct hire? Is it subcontract? That is optional. I mean, this whole thing's optional. But whether you use that within your nomenclature or not, some companies do, some companies don't. I like to use that because it immediately tells me when I look at the number what it is. The next is breaking down that CWA into the CWP type. So when you look at the nomenclature, we've got 3 digits here, a sequential digit, and then a discipline. Discipline's pretty easy to figure out. So now we know that that's CWP, because CWPs by rights within AWP are supposed to be discipline specific. Breaking down that model, we've got a CWP. It clearly ties to that CWA because you've continued your nomenclature. The type, what the sequence number is. Then when we go to break those CWPs down at the contractor level to create those work packages, we're going to another sequence number. We're just tacking that onto the same nomenclature. If we do this type of thing, not only can somebody at a glance tell exactly where that is, because it's not just an IWP, it's an IWP that's tied to that CWP from that construction work area. Seems pretty remedial. It's a suggestion from me, if you will, as to how to set up some of your nomenclatures. It doesn't have to be this way. Whatever works for your organization. The point of this, when you put something together, stick to it. Don't change halfway through. I don't know how many times we've seen that. Andrew, I'm sure you've seen that multiple times. We're like, oh, well, if we just add this in here, Wouldn't that be so much easier for us? And our systems explode. Because now they don't talk to each other. We've made a small, minute change, but it sent everything into space. So, we are here to discuss some big, quick hits, some things that you need to look at, some things that are pitfalls. Number 2, coding structures, getting that right. That's going to make things much easier. The final to this is make it a corporate standard if you can. Do it across all your projects. Digital twin is a massive movement forward right now. It's kind of the new thing on the street. I don't want to say it's totally the new thing, but owners have started to really grasp it lately and really drive it forward. When we talk about digital twin, if you've got a corporate standard for your coding structures, looking back into the past as you move forward is going to be much, much easier also across multiple projects. So,
Got one question.
yes, sir.
You know, put the system number in there as well, so you can filter the information into the completions and commissioning systems as well.
You could at these higher levels. What happens with you when you start to identify systems within your nomenclature for your work packaging breakdowns is you leave system boundary about here, right? Often CWAs, and not even the entirety of a CWA, do you have the entirety of a system within it, because your system might go from one end of the rack through several units out the other side, so there may be multiple CWAs that it's within. It may also, certainly when you get to CWPs, it may take the contents of 3 or 4 CWPs to make up the entirety of a system. So putting systems into the nomenclature, I would definitely do that in the short descriptions or those types of things, but at a CWP level, you may have 10 systems identified within one CWP, portions thereof, pieces of a system. Where that's a little different is when we talk about coal-fired power generation, pharmaceuticals, those types of organizations have witnessed that they do a lot of their data breakdown, a lot of their scheduling and identification by system. The problem with that, so I don't want to say it's a violation of AWP methodology, but the essence of an AWP methodology when we break down a plant is we break down, or a facility, whatever the facility is we break it down to how constructors are going to execute it. That's the end result, right? One crew working on a grouping of data. It doesn't matter if it's 6 systems at one time. It's a bunch of items put together into one package. They're going to mobilize. They're going to stay here within a space of this room and execute a week's worth of work kind of scenario. So it is a very good thing to consider systems. We typically would put them in subtext or descriptions to it, because why? It's going to definitely drive our prioritization, because we need to tie it to the end. We need to understand what our turnover schedules are going to be in order to prioritize those packages properly. So we do need to absolutely tie it to it directly within the nomenclature.
I think it's
Might be a little much, but yeah.
just having that tag in the model that you can filter as an option.
Right, and that, there you go, within the description field. So it's kind of like, it's a mapping of data at that point where this total tag would then have a relationship to several system IDs, which makes your data management much, much easier that way. So now you're a step ahead of me. You're taking it to the next level where we've got identification of groupings of construction data that we're tying to how we're going to execute it, we're tying to our systems. So now our data flows together. It's a very good point.
So
Any other comments?
At what level do you align with and then convert or diverge, from project controls? Because one of the hardest things I've found with WBS is project controls typically has their book that says here's our codes. They want to look at things like CapEx, ROEX, phase, cost type, blah, blah, blah. So where do you have that cutoff to the point where you have the similarity?
So, excellent question. I would turn that back as another question, first or second project. And the reason why I ask that question is the first project is going to be a pain in the butt. And I don't mean it's a pain in the butt to do it. I mean that it's going to be difficult to convince the client and those project control personnel that they possibly have to change their structure to match an AWP implementation. When we talk about data structures in AWP, as you well know, Andrew, there are multiple different things that we need to tweak. One of those would be when we start talking about our systems, and we need to tie those things together, as we mentioned earlier. Or let's look at it from a few different angles, such as supply of materials. AWP was responsible for the addition of 3 different fields to a very common material management system. SmartPlant was Marion. If you're familiar with those, the use of AWP modified the software, created the need for identifying the work package nomenclature directly within the material management system. Back when 20 years ago, when Jeff and I were fighting the good fight, they didn't want anything to do with work packaging and materials, same as project controls. Now, their software is modified to accommodate the work package breakdown structures because it's common stay, if you will. That's difficult because working with a fresh project controls group, and that's why I immediately asked the question, first or second project. Second project's easy because they'll come to you and go, okay, we had a hell of a time with data management on that last project. How can we fix that? Then you give them the silver bullet and you start implementing those. But it is difficult because trying to drive that forward and change in project controls, which project controls typically have more of a courts accounting type activity, they are more adverse to change than anybody, I find, right? So, great question. Anybody else? Comments?
Just to extend your question a little bit, the place where we have that juncture of
Right.
system and area is drawing numbers, and that's where we will struggle. How do we identify a drawing with a CWP and with the system?
Right.
Which is drawing numbers is essentially the system number, the system identifier.
Exactly, and that's why I tied it back to system immediately on that basis from here. Initial, back to the first versus second project. Initially in the first project, we're probably gonna have a bunch of lookup, spreadsheets. We're gonna have a bunch of things that's gonna be our Rosetta stones to tie things together. I'll see it coming on a project where project controls is digging in, which is fine because they need to see it often before they want to change their systems. This is what they do. They need to be convinced. We'll have a bunch of spreadsheets that say this system and this is tied to this, so that we can run just basic VLOOKUP type queries to identify what ties everything together. Then when they do see the light and we can maneuver it, we can easily manipulate that data into the systems natively. But it's often a fight and it tends to be show me. So we go through that first project, we've shown them and we move it forward.
So the ideal answer, of course, would be that we can show it's this system and it's this portion of the system that's in this area.
Right.
But that gets sort of complicated. But anyway, I haven't resolved that ourselves yet.
It's difficult. And you know what? I know of very few projects that can honestly sit there and say they have completely resolved their project controls data ties, their project controls data issues. And why? Because when we start talking about project controls, there's more than just what we're talking about here, nomenclature. Now we're getting into how do we record progress? Do we record progress in an IWP? Do we have them record progress by IWP? Do we pay by IWP? Oh my God, somebody's mind just blew up. Because when we say we're going to start paying by IWPs, contractors, everybody gets up in arms to start with. But you know what? I know lots of contracts that are now paying by done or not on an IWP. So there's multiple different things, and project controls is somebody you got to keep as a friend because it's not going to be just a nomenclature change in the beginning. It's going to be an ongoing manipulation of how they do business to tie to possibly some new methodologies. And it's an evolutionary type base to move forward. Andrew, you asked the question, what's your experience and what's worked well for you?
What we try to do is set it up at about a halfway point. So you always need project ID, the CWA, the discipline, because you need this to be the common language between the estimate, the schedule, work packaging. So we didn't want us calling piping P and then calling piping 27.
Right.
So we agreed a point of divergence, but we said that the first half of the LWPS has to agree. The second half, you get into CapEx, RevEx, material type codes, accounting stuff, and we'll get into CWPs and IWPs. But all we tried to get to them was, you have to be able to tell me, if I've got a CWP, how many hours are in that CWP. If I cannot infer that information from the estimate's failing.
Right. Excellent. Yeah, and that's exactly it. And being able to tie that data and be able to do some forensic investigations after to find out what worked, what didn't, you're going to need to be able to follow that breadcrumb trail. Any others? Have you started looking at this yet?
Yeah, we.
I know I'm picking on you,
No,
but I
you're
was
fine.
excited to find somebody who's just adopting, so.
We've,
Fully
our,
respect out the
yeah,
project this
our
stage.
name and conventions in place, and the way we have it is we've the CWA, then we have the levels the buildings we're on, then we have the sectors, and then we have the discipline, and then it's the work pack number.
Okay.
So that's how we've broken it up. And it's
Adopt a
broken
little
down.
bit different breakdown,
Just
but
slightly, yeah, so, the overall project, the database it's in covers that, you know,
Okay.
so, and we have split it up mod 1 and mod 2, so we're able to identify what phase of the project we're on, so.
was that breakdown tied to previous methodology that you had in place? How you used to do it, or?
I would say that is completely new to us.
Okay,
Yeah,
okay.
completely new to us, yeah. So, and then for work breakdown structure, the way cost control has done it is it's a one-on-one relationship. They give them a new WBS for each work pack. Now, I don't know if they'll review that in the future because that leaves them with an awful lot of data to manage, but that's the way they wanted to go this time. So, as you said,
It's an
project
evolutionary
2,
process.
Yeah, exactly.
I think we missed the boat on creating a CWP and then breaking that down into IWPs. We just broke everything down into IWPs.
Went from a much larger bucket to smaller ones immediately. Yeah, and that often we will see early adopters doing that to start with because they want to get to the money of the IWP in the field. Because that's where the rubber hits the road, right? That's your execution documentation. That's how it's being executed in the field. That's what the crew's instructions are. That's what they're doing. And the middle part, it's like, well, if we just take a we just take the CWA and break it down. And multiple years ago now, I wrote a white paper on the elimination of CWPs and full EPC contracts. Because a lot of times, do we really need it? What are we using the CWP for? Where did the CWP come from? CWP is a construction work package. It's a term that was actually absorbed by AWP. Construction work packages have existed as a contractual deliverable for decades, right? It's one of those package acronyms that's been absorbed. And it always means it's the source of a contract, typically, right? A CWP will be a contract barrier. You'll have one CWP or multiple CWPs within a single contract, but never a portion of a CWP. But if you're a full EPC contractor, do we need to separate that 100% in a smaller scope? Not always. There are methods where you could definitely go down there. What you may find is scalability is going to be where you're going to want to possibly make some changes. When we get into a very large project, you might need that granularity to control your data a little bit easier. Where the smaller projects, definitely the elimination of CWPs is not always a bad thing. But I'm always saying we go through the standard methodologies, but there are means and methods where things change.
We did find that after doing it that way, for the second phase of the project, we made the IWPs bigger.
Yeah, it was a very good lessons learned, and
Okay.
it gives us more control as well.
What's bigger? What's the size item?
The scope of work we did.
So we were originally down to, I think it was about a week's worth of work for an
Okay.
IWP, but we've increased that now, and we won't have anything under 1,000 hours where possible.
Okay.
Doesn't always work, but where possible, and that's for both mechanical and electrical packs. So,
Well, and a little history on that from the basis of the AWP community. Once upon a time, we wrote literature that said, thou shalt have packages 500 to 1,000 hours, and that's kind of where we left it. That smacked us in the teeth a lot.
Yeah.
And the reason I say it smacked us in the teeth is because, not that there was pushback on it, quite the opposite. We had a lot of people adopting that ran through their models with a knife, cookie cuttering at 500 hours and said, there's my work packs. And we're giving thought to what really makes the most sense for the actual execution of it. We've now changed that description in the research communities to be, the idea is that an IWP is supposed to be for a set duration of time for a single crew to be able to execute work from start to finish without stop. If you look at that definition, what does that mean? If I'm an iron worker crew that's putting up a bunch of bents in a stick-built rack, it's all repetitive work. I may do a 3,000-hour work package because my technical drawings are 2 drawings,
yeah.
right? And it's a situation where it's completely repetitive work. There's nothing wrong with that. However, on the flip side of that, I may be executing a piping underground program and I've got a bunch of risers that I'm installing on a header that's at the bathtub level of a site. And in installing those headers, I can't do them all at once. So now I've got one weld and one pipe. Might be a 40-hour package. because I've got all these packages out. I've got a crew excavating in that corner. They just finished that foundation, and I've got a drain for that process equipment in that area. We put that one riser. So I'll build a work package for it. I'll schedule it based on what the civil crew is going to do for their strip of that form. It's a 40-hour package. It's very small. You know, it's 4 guys per day.
Because I found also too big as well, they hang open for a long, long time and they're just not getting closed out.
Right.
Do you know, so that's another, we have to kind of, you know, there is a middle ground there, like, you know, the peach point where you can go, right, this is your pack, and you can, as you said, start it and then just close it out.
Yeah, an excellent callback to what Jeff was mentioning about closing out the packs. I think the biggest key to that, one of the largest in recent history, I'll say it was just, it finished up about $63 billion, the project. I won't mention the project by name. That particular project had lots of complications in the AWP implementation that they did. They were vast and large, we won't get into it. But one of the lessons learned in that particular project was they included holds and test requirements within the IWPs themselves.
We've kept that separate.
Amen. Thank you.
And we will continue to keep it separate. But what we had a problem with, and this is in our phase one, was identifying the work packs to the test packs. Because our construction lads are all work packs now, which is great.
Right.
But then it comes to the test pack, they've started to give me work pack name and say, well, that tested. It's like, oh. So what we're doing now is on our P&IDs, we're marking up our P&IDs with our work packs, we're overlaying them with the test packs, and then we're overlaying them with the system tags, and we're able to pull that out, and we have the relationship work pack, test pack, tag relationship there, and that will be handy for system handover.
Excellent. Are you CIM members?
No.
No? The only reason I ask is because there's a bunch of research in that exact same area that just happened. And there's another acronym, because we love our acronyms when it comes to construction. The new acronym is called the SWP.
Yeah, and we only heard that here yesterday, and
there you go.
We were like, yeah, so that's what we started to refer to them now as our
System work packages. Yeah. That's your control identification of a grouping of data as to driving IWP priority based on system completion.
And that's what we'd be turning over and commissioning, and that's where we have to get to.
Excellent.
You know, yeah.
So, come see me after. I might be able to hook you up with a report.
That'd be brilliant.
Yes, no worries. So, tying that all, it ends up in tying all that data together to bring the discussion that maybe went a little bit sideways, but it was a lot of fun. As to tie into your coding structures and be able to ensure that data flow and that your IWPs are tied to the source document of the CWA. And then you can start playing with that nomenclature and make sure it all ties back to a lot of your support packages. As I use that term, we talked about the SWP, we talked about test packages, a lot of those others. We once did a study on, okay, well, how many different acronyms are there for different packages? And somebody put their hand up in a presentation I was doing and said, there's 4. There's 4 different types of work packages. By the end of that particular meeting, we'd identified 56 packages, right? We do govern by 4, but those 4 main breakdown structures are supported by those 56 different packages and when they execute and how they interact. I'm so happy you're seeing that and you're going down that road to identify it. That's great news. All right, so let's head to the next one, number 3. Andrew, where do you think I'm going?
I didn't think it was going to be hockey. Sorry, given the audience, I didn't think it was going to be ice hockey. In England, field hockey is the ball on green.
I did that on purpose myself. I'm a Canadian. As you can see by the picture on the wall, I actually had a football picture up here, and I had no idea who the teams were. I wasn't sure I was going to offend anybody, so I stayed away from
soccer or football.
Yeah, to get
I
that right.
We had the argument last night.
That's what I meant. Not soccer, because then I might have understood who the teams were. Because hey, tennis and World Cup, that's pretty impressive. I just found out they had a team. So moving forward with that, the goal. That's the idea of this particular thing when we see this. So I live in Calgary. Jagger, big. I know he's stewing in the background. Massive Oilers fan sitting behind here, our rivals. So we won't get into that because I don't understand football 100%. You know, it's one of those situations. But where are we going with that? The goal, path of construction, interactive planning. It's all about where we're going, right? Starting with the end in mind. We've talked about putting our systems in place. We've talked about building those workflows initially so that everybody knows where we're going. And then we need to tag it, we need to name it, right? Putting those codes in place that we were talking about. Once we name it, once we do it, now we gotta do something with it. We gotta schedule it, we gotta put it into something. How do we do that? We get there through path of construction. What is path of construction? We use this term a lot. We call it the POC. Another one of those lovely acronyms we love. We now have POEs, path of engineering. We have multiple different others, acronyms that we call the path of. When we say the path of, what are we saying? We're talking about the sequence of the execution of those particular items. It's just that easy, right? So when we're talking about the path of construction, you know, somebody asked me once, what's the difference between path of construction and CPM scheduling? You know, critical path methodology. And I said, well, lots, but at the end of the day, they're going the same direction, right? Whether you are hinged on a CPM type methodology or you have more of a path of construction, interactive planning type activity driven project, they're all going in the same kind of direction. They're just identifying a little bit different things. And they work together. They're not opposed or diametrically opposed or different. They're just identifying the path of construction, where we're going, how we're going to get there, and what are our priorities to execute when. How do we do this? This, during the path of construction, is identifying our basic breakdowns. And when we talked about those 4 main packages, those types of things, you know, going from your main site plan through your CWAs, through your CWPs, the breakdowns, the 4 major gates of those CWP or of those path of construction identification. This flow chart here, real quick process analysis as to where do we do this? When are we getting into the path of construction? As soon as we start the interactive planning, that's what we're doing. Initial path of construction identification could literally be a single line on a piece of paper. We've got a project, how are we gonna build it? Oh, we're gonna go from right to left on that site plan. That's the initiation of your path of construction. Sounds very remedial, but that's where we're starting. That's gonna end up with all of the components, how they tie, how they line up to everything that we just said. Or, you know, as we go through the path of construction, the entire idea of integrated planning is so that everybody gets in a room, says everything that's important to them, and we manipulate what we would consider a best schedule, if you will, to facilitate and accommodate all those that are involved, all the participants and stakeholders in the project. At that particular point, let's look at what those kinds of meetings look like. How many of you have worked with sticky notes on your projects? Right? Everybody's done some type of CPM methodology using sticky notes, or you've used vPlanner and felt all proud that you've digitized it now. Great product, a lot of fun to work with, but I do like the tactile feel of sticky notes on a board. Everybody standing up there going, no, reaching over each other's shoulders and saying, that's before that, it has to be. We need to identify those particular priorities, put them in order. If we don't, we're gonna have a problem. I'm gonna have a stand down because you're out of order on that particular one. You're gonna order sky hooks for that because you're placing a module before I put the foundations in. You know, those types of conversations happen during these IEP sessions. Getting the path of construction initiated. I'm not gonna say right, I'm gonna say initiated. Because what we do with the path of construction is we continually iterate. We may put down our basic scope and plan as to what the POC is gonna be. We're gonna go through this plant, we're gonna go through that side, we're gonna leave that particular unit open because we're using it as crane pads and we're gonna build it from there. That type of a construction methodology type plan we're gonna put in place, and then we're gonna build on it. The initial path of construction may be something that we set in place, but it is an iterative process. What's that iterative process look like? Now you can see all those work packages work together. Here's a small portion of a lot of those different types of acronyms and those different packages and the different areas. When I say 4 main guides, if you will, and you were looking at those 4 bars in the big process overlays that we were showing, these are those bars, just in a bit different color, right? So what are we looking at with the path of construction? When we're talking about it, projects start with obviously scope development. We're identifying the scope. Remember I said, okay, we're gonna start with this plant, we're gonna move that way. Maybe we're gonna build the rack as a spine and build out from there based on the units and the supply chain, what it's giving us for a product to build that basis. We're gonna set that up initially. We're gonna identify those CWAs, right? literally caveman type activities, throw a drawing up on the wall and start taking markers to say this is CWA1 on a plot plan. It's just that simple. Sometimes it starts on a napkin. It's starting with something to identify how we're going to break down the project. And it gets more elaborate as we move forward. Path of construction being an iterative process. Once we get into full project definition, that's when our packages start to evolve and they start to follow. Everybody asks, okay, well, what's the relationship or the hierarchical basis of the work packages from CWA to CWP? What it is they tie to the path of construction. There really isn't a true hierarchy to them. There's a relational basis of how the packages work together. I hate calling it a hierarchy because it isn't depending on your information data flows, but they need to tie to how you're going to actually execute the project to the end result of the IWP, that place where we said the rubber hits the road. We won't go too far into it, but during the path of construction evolution is where your package development starts from each level. Getting that right, getting the IAP sessions identified is really the main task to getting that third aspect of our presentation here together, right? Setting those three things in motion is going to tie to multiple other things. That's going to really get things rolling for you in a bunch of different directions. If you don't tie these activities to your IAP sessions, what do you have? You have an everybody solo type situation. How many times on a project have you had civil saying, hey, we'll let you know when we're done? Okay, or you've had the electricians come in and say, God darn it, we got everything in our way. Why do you have everything in our way? You know, I looked at the models 18 times, there was not supposed to be something there. Why can't I run my trace there? Why can't I do my pulls? Why? Typically, because we didn't have proper integrated planning sessions. They weren't all in the room together. You know, you look at a schedule can look amazing. You know, we've talked about 4D simulations. Who here's run a 4D simulation? What's some of the big things that you identify right away? Other than out of sequence work, that's pretty typical. But
Well, when I run them, I'm basically just giving the information from the construction guys, and then I just create an analysis.
right.
They give me the information.
Build on that a little bit. What happens when you show a 4D simulation to a construction guy? Often what ends up happening, at least in the first interactions, if there wasn't an IAP session involved in the creation of those schedules and the creation of that 4D simulation, this construction guy will go, well, that's awfully pretty, but that's not how I'm going to build it.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know how many times I've gone onto a site to assist, or what I call smoke jumping. The first part of my career was pretty much all smoke jumping. This is blown up, can you come help? And in doing that initial audit of where did it go wrong, I'll talk to general foreman or 4 people in the field, lead hands, and the first question I ask them is, okay, how's the reporting against the schedule for progress? How's the schedule working for you? And they'll look at me and they'll say, schedule, it's there. We use it for reporting progress. Okay, well, are you following it? Well, no, we got our own thing. We got our own schedule over here. We do our own thing. But that's what they set up, so we follow the schedule for reporting. So wait, the schedule is for execution? Well, yeah, but that's our reporting schedule is what we call it now, because it's not really how we're going to execute it. That's because we didn't do a proper integrated plan through a path of construction where all the shareholders were in the room, started to drive it forward so that we had buy-in across the different stakeholders. And when I say stakeholders, I'm not just talking disciplines. I mentioned, you know, the electricians to the pipe fitters to the civil individuals. This is project controls, it's scheduling in the room. It's the work-face planners, it's the planning department that often facilitates these tied to project controls. But getting this right and getting this ingrained in your department is key. A lot of times we'll start with this type of environment. We'll lay it down, we'll go through it once. How many projects have you seen, or how many times have you been on a project, or maybe just once, where we've gone through this big thing? We've had probably the most expensive room ever in the project, meaning that if you take a step back and look at what that room is costing the project per hour, you know, you're often at the tens of thousands of dollars an hour, just in wages to run those rooms. So you need to drive it forward. Lots of times I've seen we build these, we go through them. I'm not sure if you recognize that gentleman. That's Mr. Fernando Espana there in that particular picture that from ConstructX. I borrowed this picture from him. And he facilitates these really well. Often we build these and then we do nothing with it. or it sets our initial CPM schedule and that's it. And then we don't revisit. Remember when I showed you here, for this, it's an iterative process. That's the big key that I want you to take away from this particular issue is we don't just set it once, forget it, and move forward. We start it, we get together, we identify our first path, and then it's continually iterated beyond that. We often go through, and I'll go forward a little bit here, what we call an accordion model. Those of you that are students of Lean or familiar with the Lean implementation, very familiar with this type of a planning methodology. Basically, all this means, I love the Lean guys, they come up with great terms and great ways of doing this. In essence, all this is, let's get together, talk about it, and then we're gonna actually go do something. Let's go do something. Once we actually do what we said we were gonna do, let's get back together and discuss it. So once we get back together and discuss it, now we're iterating that path of construction. Path of construction on a lot of projects or basic CPM schedule projects start here and end here, die on the vine there. And then when we get to this point, they're like, well, I'm reporting to the schedule. Are you using it? No, reporting to. It's a reporting tool. That's what the client's grading me by, so I'm reporting to that schedule, but am I following it? No. Why? Because we didn't do this. Lean does a very good job of explaining what those type of interactions need to look like and how you work through that fat and get that to happen. So, meet, go away, do your thing, get back together, meet, talk about what you did. You know, get together, manipulate that plan, change it so that it is an iterative basis. Those three things put together all tied to this basic timeline that I like to live and die by on a project, if you will. This is, I call this the Rosetta Stone timeline. If you're familiar with several organizations or ways of looking at this, across the top, CII staging, stage gates. When you look at this, CII has stage 0 now, out over here from the latest 3 series research. What's the 3 series research mean? 364, 365, 363, throwing a bunch of numbers out. That's what they call their research teams, all by number. Have identified now 0, which is pre-planning, and then much more evolution of the model into stage 4, which is true commissioning turnover and client work. So this is maybe a little dated, but we don't need to talk about those other ones. This is the meat of it, right? So stage 1, 2, 3, it's the CII staging. I get the question all the time, okay, well, CII says these stages are this way, but we do an FEL type project. That's our stage gates for engineers, so where's that tied? In here, it's stage 1, FEL 1, 2, and 3, showing where it ties in through detailed engineering and then through execution. Maybe you're an APAC, maybe you're an Asian-based company, or it's a project that you're executing from the docks in Korea, those types of things. It's very common in Asia to use a phasing approach like this, where you see the different phases like that, rather than an FEL base or the stage gates that we steer through CII. So what this is you may be asking, okay, well, from the IAP sessions he was just talking about, how do I tie that into how we actually control a project? These three are more common than not. You may call them something different within your organization, probably because you've got a proprietary delivery system that's been developed within your organization and you've changed the names a little bit, or maybe they're the exact same names. You probably tie to one of these three types of methodologies. That ties to what we were just talking about. The stage gates for POC, the basic execution and milestones for your average project executing AWP. All of the things that we just talked about kind of tie to ensuring that you set a great foundation for each of the milestones through your project execution and your life cycle to ensure that you get there. We've hit just the very tip of the iceberg of AWP implementation, but those three things, and we won't go through those details because we just did, will set you in the right direction, if you will, in how you're going to execute a project. Everything else is going to line up with those three things. Get them in place. Andrew called one out right off the bat, obviously, as the path of construction is a strong one, and we've had lots of discussion about it. So, as a gift, because as I mentioned, we are a training institution at the AWP University. Myself, and my background, I come from the field, and I know that often we need to get this stuff circulated. So, what I've done here is I've produced for you all a QR code that allows you to get in there and distribute a 2.5 hours with quizzes. If you want to take the quizzes and examination, which actually gets you a certificate to say that you did the executive. What this is this is an excellent tool for taking it back to your organization to sell it internally. What do I mean by that? Often you'll go into a meeting and go, AWP, it's awesome, it does this, we're going through there, and then go, not sure I truly understand exactly the direction of it. The particular development of this is tied to the basics, some of the basic stuff we talked about. It's also tied to case studies and a lot of things that you might want to bring forward for business case utilization. So it's a great tool. Lots of vendors that I work with use it with their clients. It's just a good refresher for what the heck AWP is. Then of course, we have a full suite of training options, which from that QR code will get you 15% off all of our retail online content. As I mentioned earlier, we do full corporate integration and custom training at the corporate level also. But I thought I'd bring these through to you because they're excellent tools to use in your implementations and driving it forward. So with that, I think we're right on time. So I'll thank you for coming and thank you for support from some of my colleagues that I've worked with forever. Jeff, it's great to see you again, as well Andrew. And to you all, enjoy the rest of the conference. There's not much left.